Welcome to Orthodox Christian Theology. This is Craig Truglia, and with me tonight is John Collorafi. John, how are we doing?
Fine, Craig. Very pleased to be with this audience tonight.
It's a real pleasure to really continue this series with you. I think it's been the most important work I've been doing on YouTube. Being that you have a published book, I wouldn't say you quite say that, but it's a real pleasure to have you on and discuss this. I'm going to do our little spiel in the beginning. And so those are not aware, the Bishop of Rome over the centuries was the single most important bishop on earth. This is the history of the papacy. Though the term papacy is an anachronism, we will use the term due to its popular acceptance. By God's grace, we will undergo an unprecedented presentation on the subject. Never has the history of this institution been covered from its origins up until a century before the Great Schism in a methodical, well-rounded way. There is both a Catholic and Orthodox lay expert, well-read in the primary sources, whose task will be to make available to the listener the content necessary to become informed on the subject. The hope is that this will create a fair and balanced overall presentation, which will leave the viewer more informed in the subject than he or she would otherwise be, hearing one side in isolation. Though the presenters will strive for impartiality, the listener should expect that the Orthodox and Catholic sides will have very different presuppositions which may color their presentations. The Orthodox side will probably presume upon the papacy corresponding to Orthodox canonical norms, which, despite elements of headship exercised by the Pope, such as the capacity to hear appeals, subjugates the Bishop of Rome to a conciliar system which has the final say. The Catholic side will probably presume upon the papacy corresponding to Catholic canon law, which asserts the Pope as supreme, immediate, universal, and ordinary power and dogmatic infallibility. One should strive for transparency when inferences made from the historical evidence are colored by such presuppositions. Each century of church history will be covered in a single episode up until the 9th century. 4 or 5 different topics per century are covered. The goal is for each side to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, but we might go over. We'll try to observe the honor rule when it comes to time. We're covering the 5th century tonight, so you'll probably notice we'll do some topics like in a minute, and others may be a little longer. The Orthodox and Catholic side will alternate who speaks first, so no side has the last word each time. After all the topics are presented, each speaker will be given 5 minutes to offer closing thoughts on the century. There will be no live question and answers to reduce showtime. Please like the video, share it, and leave questions so we can respond to them in writing or in future question and answer episodes. Now, today we're doing the 6th century, and the topics in the 6th century we'll be covering will be the Symacchean Forgeries, the Formula of Hormisdas, the Council of 536, the Byzantine Papacy, and the events surrounding Pope Vigilius in the 5th Ecumenical Council. Now, John, I honestly forget. Do you remember who started first last time? Because I'm trying to figure out who's going to start first this time.
Craig, I've totally forgotten, but I have to warn you that some of my friends, they'll usually be very nice to how I perform, but they want me to be more aggressive. No more Mr. Nice Guy. So,
well, John, I can handle it.
You can handle it. Okay, I just wanted to let you know.
All right. So
a little tougher, and because tonight, there's some major misapprehension about some of the issues tonight, so I get argumentative usually when there's some major misunderstanding to be cleared up. So with that,
So we got salty John, salty and aggressive John. Do you want to start first or second? Your call.
Okay, well, in accordance with the new alpha male John, I'm going to start first. How's that?
All right, sounds good, John. So, John, the floor is yours. Symacchean Forgeries.
Okay. All right, so you've heard the talking points. I'm going to change a couple of words here to protect the culprits, but you've heard those rhetorical questions. If you own the car, why forge the title to the car? wake up in 2084 in this world, cops will be stopping young men in the ghetto saying, hey, if that's really your ghetto blaster, why forge the receipt for the boombox? So the pseudo-Symacchean forgeries is that's what the scholars call them. Unfortunately, I can't give background here because we have to get right into it. The scholars are going to tell you that there are about 5 forgeries during the early 6th century under Pope Symmachus, who was in a very heated struggle with another Deacon Laurentius for the Roman Bishopric, the Papacy, in other words, but for the Bishopric of Rome. Also during this time, I believe it was the Gothic king Theodoric wanted to put Symmachus on trial for certain sin against chastity, some say celebrating Easter on the wrong day. Now, the scholars will tell you that there's about 5 forgeries designed to show that the first see is judged by no one. The first see judged by no one. And this is done by the most part, by what the scholars consider apocryphal or fake early councils intended to show this, where a pope is, put on trial, and I don't know, like a voice comes out of heaven, like, can't do it, first see is judged by no one. The best known one is called Constitutum Silvestri. So I want to talk about this because of all of this hullabaloo, about that rhetorical question. Because I hear it over and over again that the papal power is based on forgeries. Yeah, if you really own the car, why forge the title? We're going to have cops stopping people at checkpoints asking this question if this goes on much longer. All right, so I've seen it argued. Well, first of all, before we get to that, I happen to have experience debunking talk about papal forgeries. Go to 4th century episode, Arabic canons, and I see at the end, I spent 20 years of my life with major studies of Syriac literature and a lot of other disciplines to show that the Arabic canons are not a papal forgery. So you can go to that. Now, I don't have 20 years of my life that I'll never get back to devote to pseudo-Symmachians, but I did discover some things. So the first thing is that with forgeries, you have pre-existing material sometimes that is mixed in with the fiction. And I discovered at least 3 points of pre-existing material. So the notion that the first see is judged by no one, or that the first see confirms the councils, was already in the papal letters from a very recent date to the pseudo-Symmachians. In fact, I have right here Pope Gelasius, who was, maybe a few years, 10, 15 years before Symmachus. So his letter to the bishops of Dardania, 495, says, the first see confirms every synod by its authority. That's the first thing. And then later on in the letter, he says, we will not pass over in silence what every church throughout the world knows, that the see of the blessed apostle Peter has the right to absolve from what has been bound by the sentence of any prelates whatsoever, and has the right of judging of the whole church. Neither is it lawful to pass judgment on its judgment. And we also have in 493 we have Pope Gelasius to Faustus saying that the canons themselves willed the appeals of the whole church, referred to the see's examination from it. They decreed also that no appeal whatsoever ought to be made, and thereby that it judged of the whole church and itself fell under the judgment of none. That's Stele, Romanorum Pontificum Epistolae 344. The other text to Dardania was Stele 395, 399. So that's pre-existing. It's not something that needed to be made up. Another pre-existing element that I found, one of the pseudo-Symaccheans has a pope right before the 4th century, the turn of the 4th century, St. Marcellinus. Supposedly he was guilty of burning incense to idols, but that he couldn't be convicted because the first see is judged by no one. So that's pre-existing in the sense that these accusations against this saint, and even some of the other early popes I found, are mentioned by St. Augustine in the De Unico Baptismo. And St. Augustine said, since there's no proof, I'm not going to entertain it. In other words, he's innocent until proven guilty. Now you notice that the pseudo-Symacchean makes him guilty in order to say that, you can't do it. The first see is judged by no one. Okay, so this is a little bit like the cry room at my church.
Yeah, sorry.
A little bit of the back room, which is fine, by the way. I'm all for it. For the background noise. I have seen it. So we have to ask ourselves. I've seen it argued seriously that, notwithstanding these pre-existing principles in the papal letters, that the popes would have needed this sort of forgery to defend themselves. Now, to show you the degree to which this mocks your intelligence, let's take Pope Leo. Imagine St. Leo the Great in this position, such as Symmachus was. Now, the notion that he would have been so helpless that he'd need to resort to forgeries like this, like a baby who needs his diaper changed. I find this stunningly injurious, but we'll try it out. Let's try that out. You're talking about the Pope who told Attila the Hun to take a hike would have been helpless. Let's try that one out. There's a Latin inscription about him from Verassi, which says, I'm going to translate it roughly, the tome bears witness which he sent. To teach aright was his intent. He roared, and wild beasts quaked in fear, and the sheep his command did hear. So, he roared, and wild beasts, meaning heretics, quaked in fear. But he would have been helpless before such an accusation, before the likes of Attila the Hun. He told, get out of here. Don't come back.
Now, John, I'm just going to pause you for a second. Tell people to be quiet in the background. One sec. All right, John, here you go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're testing out this. Now, it turns out that St. Leo was put to the test when he was, in the so-called excommunication by Dioscorus. We talked about this last time. Now, was he able to handle this, or was it too tough? Well, turns out that he sent his legates to Chalcedon, saying, we know what they said. We have orders in our hands from the apostolic man, Leo, who was head of all the churches, that Dioscorus is not to sit in the council. By the way, this head of all the churches here is not a regional primacy. No. Not a patriarchal primacy either. They're saying it's interpatriarchal. They're saying, we have orders that Dioscorus is not to sit in the council. Hey, either he goes or we leave. How does that grab you? I'm paraphrasing here. We know what happened, a little bit of discussion. What's your problem? What's your specific issue? The commissioners want to know, and they say, no, he's here to be judged. He dared to hold a synod. He dared to judge, which is not his place. and to hold a synod. Now he's here to be judged. And we know the results. We know that 5 days later, the papal legate Pascasinus solemnly anathematizes Dioscorus. This was clearly done with the consent of the emperor because, as Father Price says, ecumenical councils are imperial councils, so he says. So we're told now. So, with the consent of the imperial council, the papal legate Pascasinus solemnly anathematized Dioscorus with the approval of Saint Anatolius, a former representative of Dioscorus who went over to the other side, as well as the rest of the bishops. So it looks like Saint Leo was able to handle it. All right. Now, he could have also quoted the letters of Valentinian and Galla Placidia to Theodosius II earlier in the same crisis, which talks about, Valentinian talks about how antiquity conferred on the Bishop of Rome the principatus, the principality overall. Now, that's a Roman emperor talking to, another emperor. So, you're talking, Roman emperors would know something about principatus and what that word means. You're talking about the highest level of apostolic authority. Popes use that word principatus. They need, whether they want to enter anywhere and do whatever happens to need to be done. So St. Leo passed the test. So we were told, now, finally, for those who want to make this argument, look, if they were serious, what they would do is we would see maybe editions of the papal letters, or at least texts out there, maybe color-coded to show, how much first of all, they would show which, if any, of these popes in the first 8 centuries even quoted the Constitutum Silvestri or any of these other papal forgeries. Now, some of them are quoted when you get into the 9th and further. That I certainly have found. So, if we wanted serious scholarship, we might see a stream with, pages put up in Latin, color-coded to show just how much of these letters of Pope Nicholas or anyone else were quoting, pseudo-Symaccheans, and how much were quoting real canons, ecumenical or otherwise, how much is quoting scripture, patristics, the general tradition of the church, this kind of thing. How much of that have you seen? It doesn't even rise to the level of not a whole lot. You've seen zilch. 0. Nada. That's quite a homework assignment I gave them. If they did that homework, they might not have time to do, daily streams that are as long as the Grammy Awards or something. Who's going to do that homework assignment? I'll probably be left to do it sometime.
Poor John.
Okay, I don't know how much I did on time, Craig, but I've had enough of this. Back to you.
All right, and I'm going to remind my audience they got to be quiet. All right, so I'm now going to give the Orthodox presentation. I'm going to say I agree with John. The Pseudo-Symaccheans, I unfold this, you're going to find really don't have much application in the 6th century. But they're interesting and necessary to talk about. Here's why. And let me just decrease my microphone real quick because I think I'm going to be coming in too loud. I'm sorry, John. All right, I'm going to do this. So, all right. Now, when it comes to the Pseudo-Symaccheans, they're made during a disputed election between Pope Symmachus and Laurentius. Laurentius is known as the anti-pope, but that would have been less clear at the time. Let me give the background. The latter, Laurentius, supported the Miaphysite Henoticon and had Byzantine support. But Theodoric the Great and Arian Ostrogoth initially supported Symmachus as a bulwark of Roman independence from the Byzantine Church. So that means against the Henoticon, right? Like he doesn't want his empire to be on the same page as the Byzantine Church because they're a different empire. Now, the Roman Senate, in opposition to the Ostrogoths, supported Laurentius' cause and sought deposition of Symmachus for violation of laws. Symmachus lost much of his support, and Laurentius assumed control of the churches in Rome itself. In modern times, in fact, the Basilica of St. Paul contains the papal portrait not of Symmachus, but Laurentius among the popes. You can read about this in Moorhead, the Laurentian Schism, page 134. Now, the forgeries... Symmachus eventually regained the papacy with Theodoric's support, and Laurentius retired. The forgeries were made in support of Symmachus, but the reason we care is they introduced the novel quote. All right, and that quote in Epistle 26, "The see of the blessed Peter the Apostle has the right to judge the whole church, neither is it lawful for anyone to judge its judgment." Epistle 10 says something similar, that the Roman see cannot be judged by anyone. Now, the precedent for this statement is from Pope Zosimus. We quoted it in our last episode, where Zosimus says, "Our authority is such that nobody may review our sentence." Right? So just the words at face value really aren't terribly new, as John was alluding to. I do want to point out that Pope Zosimus was citing a local dispute when he said those things. But as we can see, the rhetoric of Zosimus has evolved. The Synod of Palmaris in 502 states that the first see, that's the Pope, is judged by none, with the conclusion that God alone is the Pope's judge. Now, Western tradition, like the Council of Rome 465, was that papal encyclicals and decrees were treated as canons, which are authoritative in their jurisdiction. So most of the bishops supported Symmachus and readily accepted the rationale as a convenient means of defying Theodoric's call for a synod to depose Symmachus at that time. Right? So you could cite Pope Zosimus because it's a papal statement. So that means Theodoric can't tell you what to do. It makes ecclesiastical sense. Now, the same synod, not coincidentally, removed the legal necessity that the King of Italy must consent to a pope's election. This is something that continually goes on and off the books in ongoing centuries. Now, Deacon future Pope Hormisdas read the statements during that synod. And you can read about that in Moorhead, the Laurentian Schism, page 131. Now, did these forgeries express a popular idea that shows papal supremacy in late antiquity? Some say yes, like John here. Now, I want you to consider their argument from I'm going to make their argument a little bit. There have been, up to this point, no official papal depositions. All right? Even after St. Liberius signed the Arianized Creed, he was deposed. Now, the only possible exception, Pope Marcellinus, may have been deposed, but the sources are scant. All right? So let's look at the other patriarchates. Local and inter-patriarchal synods have deposed Patriarchs Alexandria, like St. Athanasius and Dioscorus, Constantinople, Maximus the Cynic and Nestorius, Antioch, Paul of Samosata and John of Antioch, and Jerusalem, St. Maximus of Jerusalem. So it looks like only Rome has never been judged, if we just go by the history. So, right, someone saying that would have not sounded very crazy in the 6th century. Now, most likely, due to the chaotic situation after the fall of Rome, the Symacchean faction was trying to insulate the Roman synod from foreign influence and prevent, one, his local synod from deposing him. Remember, the city of Rome favored Laurentius and all the clergy there. So they needed an ecclesiastical rationale so they don't depose him. Two, the Laurentian faction attaining the consent of the other patriarchates, as was customary for the deposition of patriarch. So as we covered in previous episodes, like with Paul of Samosata and Nestorius, a local jurisdiction can't just depose a patriarch. They need the consent of the other patriarchates. So Rome was trying to preempt this by saying you can't judge him. So by doing that, now your consent is irrelevant. And three, overt imperial meddling, right? Like Theodoric. That's why they made his ability to consent to an election no longer part of the canons. Now, Symacchean ecclesiology contradicted the understanding that other patriarchs can overrule Rome's judgment, as we see in Augustine's letter 43. Now, the fact that Pope Severius, 3 decades later, was deposed by imperial decree, and this was accepted by the Roman Synod, which then, with imperial persuasion, by the way, elected Vigilius, shows that the very precedent that the Symacchean forgeries tried to prevent failed in the same century. The ultimate acceptance of these forgeries over time had in effect inserted into Western canon law an ecclesiastical tenet opposed to the consensus-based ecclesiology of the Church, which governed depositions and appeals for 5 centuries. But as John alludes to, you won't see him quoted for the next few centuries. It's just something that way, way later becomes relevant. It created a rhetorical precedent. Now, a string of papal depositions occurred in the 10th and 11th centuries during a papal nadir called the Pronocracy, which indicates, in my opinion, that even centuries later, even many centuries later, these tenets were codified as canon law in the West, but they were not taken seriously. This makes sense given the deep roots of the original consensus-based ecclesiology of the Church. All right. So anyway, that is the Pseudo-Symacchean Forgeries. Now I'm going to start with the Formula of Hormisdas. So you ready, John?
Yeah, ready. Go
All right, so I'm going, and then we'll go with you. Now, we've already had, John and I, a whole show on this topic. All right, so I'm not going to give all the details. Let's cut to the chase. Does the formula teach papal infallibility? Does it teach that union with Rome is the measure of being within the Church? What did Hormisdas intend to convey? Did the Church of that reservation accept its claims? Let's look at all these questions. First, the issues of infallibility and union with Rome. I'm going to quote the formula. For it's impossible that the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, who said, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church," should not be verified. And their truth has been proved by the course of history, for in the Apostolic See, the Catholic religion has always been kept unsullied. And so I hope I may deserve to be associated with you in the one communion which the Apostolic See proclaims, and which the whole true and perfect security of the Christian religion resides. Now, the passage claims Roman unsullibility and wholeness of doctrine. All right, those are the words it uses, not necessarily infallibility in these later concoctions. Now, Pope Zephyrinus, for example, was too friendly to Sabellus. Pope Marcellinus apostatized. He did repent. St. Liberius signed an Aaronite creed under torture. The heretical intercommunion of Anastasius II did occur, like we covered in the last century. And the heresies of potential popes Laurentius and Novatian. Right? So Hormisdas leaves it unsaid how to categorize these exceptions, because I just named a bunch of exceptions where it looks like there were some errors that were made by the Pope. So how do we understand what Hormisdas intended to mean, other than him just being wrong? Was it honorific? Was it generally true, but not specifically true? Should we infer Vatican I distinctions concerning ex-cathedra statements taught to the whole Church, which had no formal as compared to material errors, right? So all those would have been material errors, but not formal errors. The first two things, honorifics or general truths, make the most sense as we have explicit historical language, examples of language being used in this way, such as Pope Leo's ascription to the infallibility to Emperor Leo I. But no historical example of anyone explicitly citing Vatican I distinctions. So that's why I don't favor that inference. Now, historically, these words are more extreme than what we have seen elsewhere in the interpatriarchal context, representing an advance in rhetoric but not substance. So John could cite similar statements said in a local Western context, but we really don't see this in interpatriarchal international context. So it is an advance in rhetoric. The Formula Hormisdas is very meaningful in that way. The passage does not explicitly state that union with Rome is non-negotiable, because to infer otherwise would contradict the fact that Rome was wrong during the Meletian Schism. And we cover that in the 4th century. Now, Hormisdas, who had a hand in the Symacchean Forgeries, certainly intended to aggrandize Roman claims in the interpatriarchal realm in order to insulate Rome from foreign interference. So I think he said these things with a purpose. The Ostrogoths at this point were past their zenith of power, and by the writing of this formula, Byzantium under Justin and St. Justinian were starting to gain more influence in the West. Now, Hormisdas, aware of this, was attempting to maintain Rome's ecclesiastical independence and prestige from Byzantine encroachment. The preceding explains how the East and Rome responded to the issuing of this formula. Now, Hormisdas was willing to negotiate certain elements of language determined who would be on the diptychs or not. So you can see this in letters 158, 159, the Claxio Avellana, or Hormisdas letter 26. Now, Constantinople ultimately agreed to a slight change of language, which accepted the validity of Vacatious Holy Orders, which is a continuation of a policy for Pope Anastasius II. So that concession Hormisdas made is a continuation of something that during the Acacian Schism was already conceded by one of the popes. Now, John II of Constantinople added an audacious addition to his signature to the formula. He wrote in Hormisdas, letter 63, I hold the most holy churches of your elder and our new Rome to be one church. I define that the see of the Apostle Peter, that's Rome, and this of the imperial city, Constantinople, to be one see. Now, papal legate Dioscorus wrote apologetically to Hormisdas, said John II, I'm going to quote him, tried to make out it, the formula to libellus, was a letter rather than a libellus. And, to quote him, appropriate for a libellus, he allowed for the aforementioned signature. That's in CA 167, quote, in page 81, A Conflict and Negotiation in the Early Church. So this shows that we are to interpret John II's signature as a qualified acceptance of the formula. What are the qualifications? The formula is not viewed as a decree, as we see. The formula is true inasmuch as Rome and Constantinople are fundamentally one see. Now, the verbiage allowed Hormisdas to save face by interpreting one see to pertain to their union. Yet one was clearly intended to conflate the prerogatives of Constantinople with Rome, with words, I define, quoting John, being an assertion of power in keeping with Canon 28 of Chalcedon, as historians such as Friend in the Monophysite movement, page 239, have observed. Now, Hormisdas was willing to accept that those entering into union with him affirmed Chalcedon and rejected the Henoticon. Roman supremacy was not even on the table. What's my proof for this? There's two good reasons. First, Hormisdas in letter 80 only explicitly demanded that Chalcedon and its doctrines be affirmed. We can read this in paragraphs 15 to 17 via a written profession of faith, I'm quoting him, sent to Constantinople and then forwarded to Rome for review, in which it would be accepted as long as it was, to quote Hormisdas, written, however, in the same tenor. This definitively proves that written professions of faith were not ad verbatim the formula, but rather something similar, the same tenor, which explicitly accepted Chalcedon. There is no mention in letter 80 that any of the papal prerogatives had to be reiterated in these similar professions of faith. Now, it doesn't mean that they weren't. It doesn't mean maybe he didn't imply it. It just, the letter doesn't say it. I'm going by what the letter says. Now, second, the formula was circulating since 515 AD. In CA letter 139 from the Syrian monks from about the letter 518 gives us an idea of what our profession in the same tenor may look like. The Syrian letter mimics the formula's language. It cites Matthew 16:19 instead of Matthew 16:18. It affirms Chalcedon and rejects Acacius and his clergy, whom they were never in communion with anyway. And it interestingly affirms that Rome's authority comes from Peter and Paul. Now, the formula only speaks of Peter. Now, Hormisdas, instead of responding indignantly that they meddled with a papal proof text and didn't send them the formula back ad verbatim, approved of their letter. He cited their firmness of faith, which was exhibited by the letter, and concurred that the hearts of the apostles, plural, meaning both Peter and Paul, lay the foundation of the church. My opinion is that Hormisdas was more seriously looking for a rejection of Acacius and his followers than an affirmation of non-literal ecclesiastical claims, especially from Syrians on the fringes of the Byzantine Empire who were not a geopolitical threat. Their submission to the formula with these papal distinctives insulating Rome from Byzantine encroachment was less relevant than, obviously, Constantinople's. Now, the language of the formula soon disappears from ecclesiastical discourse until the 9th century, where it was altered radically in the Greek to remove papal claims, which were at that point taken much more seriously. Now, in short, the formula Hormisdas shows an advance in rhetoric, I argue, on the back of the Symacchean Forgeries, but explicit evidence, keyword, explicit evidence of papal supremacy being exerted is lacking. So with that said, John, the floor is yours. I'm just going to boost your audio. So you could go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we talked about the Acacian-schism last time, so I apologize that we can't go into that background. But when it began, the end was near when Justin came in 518, and this holy patriarch John II comes in. He actually is coming into the sanctuary for the divine liturgy, and people are demanding that he proclaim Feast of the Council of Chalcedon. Of whom are you afraid, they say. Emperor Justin, conquer, proclaim the Council of Chalcedon. We won't leave until you have proclaimed it. They say, we're not leaving here. they're pretty decent theologians. They demand that the synodical letters must go to Rome, which is a condition for ending the schism, reestablishing the communion of Rome. Now that whole scene is in Mansi 1057, goes on. So it's actually resolved quite quickly because of the goodwill of the emperor. Most of the wrangling was actually who was going to be excluded from the dictics rather than questions of Rome's place or the papal power per se. But I'm going to actually tell you what the libellus says, that everybody understands what we're talking about. This had been composed a little bit earlier. It's already existed. So it says, the first condition of salvation is to keep to the rule of the true faith and to deviate in no way from the tradition of the fathers. And because the teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ cannot be overlooked, which says, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, these things which have been said are proven by the events, because in the Apostolic See the Catholic religion has always been preserved immaculate. Now, they go on to anathematize everybody that Rome said that they had to anathematize, and they get to this part. Consequently, we receive and approve all the letters of the blessed Pope Leo, which he wrote concerning the true faith. Wherefore, as we have already said, following in all things the Apostolic See and preaching whatever has been decreed by it, I hope that I may deserve to be in one communion with you, which the Apostolic See preaches, which is the complete and true solidity of the Christian religion. Now, on the diptychs, I also promise that during the celebration of the sacred mysteries, I shall not recite the names of those who are separated from the communion of the Catholic Church, that is, those who do not agree in every respect with the Apostolic See. All right, so who are those who are separated from the communion of the Catholic Church? Those who do not agree in every respect with the Apostolic See. And then finally, this profession of faith I have signed with my own hand and offered it to you, Hormisdas, holy and venerable Pope of the city of Rome. Okay. Boy, Jack Webb on Dragnet couldn't give a better smackdown speech than that. I love this. Okay. Now, we have to say that's what happened. That's what they were signing. Okay, that's what they're signing. And let's get into how many priests or bishops actually signed it. Now, I don't think 2,500 bishops signed it. I think that's an exaggeration. The Deacon Rusticus, around 550, speaks of the libelli, the professions of faith, of perhaps 2,500 sacerdotes, priests, under Emperor Justin, after the schism of Peter of Alexander and Acacius, Peter Mongus of Alexander and Acacius, PL 67, 1251. Okay, now that might include priests, archimandrites, bishops, fine. But the Collectio Avellana, that 6th century compilation of important papal documents, does call it a, quote, libellus, or profession of faith, which Pope Hormisdas laid down to be given by all the bishops of Greece. CSEL 35-800. When you see blogging that is disconnected from the primary sources, then it has no value. We're going to see a lot of that. So, when you see bloggers trying to make objurgatory comments about the libellus or trying to distance themselves or to distance the Eastern Church from it, I want to just tell you what the sources say. Now, here we have one also from Collectio Avellana, so it's first-hand account. From one of the legates, the subdeacon named Polion. He says, now this applies to Constantinople. I'm not saying everywhere else, but in Constantinople. The whole course of ecclesiastical business worked out in such a way that beyond any doubt, everything occurred through a miracle of Blessed Peter. On Thursday, the Lord's Supper, the bishop came into the palace in a general meeting, and after reading the libellus, he was in agreement and subscribed with the greatest devotion. We went from the palace into the church with the greatest solemnity. The pomp and circumstance to further strengthen the concord of faith and of hearts. It is hardly possible to believe what weeping for joy there was in the immense extent of the crowd. The crowd itself bore witness to its joy, nor could it be doubted that a heavenly hand was present to confer such joy upon the world. The name of Acacius, the anathematized prevaricator, as well as that of the other bishops who followed him in communion, were erased before our eyes. In like manner, the names of Anastasius and Zeno, these are emperors, were removed from recitation at the altar. Through your prayers, peace has been restored to the minds of Christians. For the whole church there is but one mind, but one joy. Only the enemy of the human race is mourning. CSCL 35, 683. Okay, now, sometimes the Pope used this again. There's another case which I have to be talking about later. When Pope Agapetus went to Constantinople, he discovered that the bishop there was a heretic. He deposed him. This was at the request, actually, of the monks and Orthodox clergy.
Hey, John, if you don't mind if I interrupt, so you want to cover 536 now, or is this just a brief aside?
No, I don't. Am I over time?
No, it's just that's the next topic, but your call.
Right. Okay. I'm just mentioning this.
Okay.
I'm going to come in a moment, but I'm just saying we're going to be talking about it in the next topic in detail. But just to say that he did have Justinian sign a similar formula with a couple of changes, and that he promised to observe it in such a way that the patriarchs would follow Rome, metropolitans follow the patriarchs, bishops follow the metropolitans, that the Catholic Church would have her solidity in all respects. That's BSCL 35, 340. And here in this form that says that the Catholic religion is always preserved inviolate. CSCL 35, 338, 339. Now, as far as Jerusalem was concerned, the other patriarch, it's true that Pope, we talked about that in the earlier program, where I translated letter of Pope Hormisdas to Epiphanius of Constantinople, giving him, quote, the prefecture of the Apostolic See, resolve those problems with the libelli in the same tenor as you have noted in your presentation. So with that, I'll just go ahead and turn it back to you.
Well, it's back to you again. The Synod of 536 in Constantinople. Take your time and give any insight you want to give on that topic. That's our next topic.
Oh, okay, great. Okay, so Pope Agapetus in 535 goes to Constantinople because there was a political conflict between the emperor and the Gothic king. And the Gothic king, Theodahat, sent them to try to make peace with Justinian. So Agapetus was there on a mission to reconcile these factions. Sort of like Christian Mario, if you've been following the drama last week on the apologetics community.
Oh, well, let's talk about that after the show, because I haven't been.
Oh, that was meant to be a joke, Craig. Some of the people might get it. Okay, so... but it turns out the Pope died in April of 536. I believe the quarrel was that I think the Gothics wanted certain churches, and if not, they were going to make war and just destroy a bunch of stuff. And Agapetus was kind of sent there to kind of make peace and see what he could do to work things out without having a war. So now, while Pope Agapetus was there, he found that Anthimus was a heretic, Miaphysite. Sorry about that. He deposes him. Now, the Liber Pontificalis, which is probably a very decent source by this time, 6th century, actually has him arguing with Justinian about something, and Justinian says, either agree with us or go into exile. So Pope Agapetus says, oh, okay, fine. Your bishop, Anthimus, let him confess two natures. This is one of the great gotcha moments in all history. And so it turns out the Pope may have been tipped off, whatever, but Anthimus was indeed a Monophysite. And so he had, Miaphysite. You see, I'm I'm outdated with this. They used to say monophysite a long time ago. Now it's meophysite. Fine. So, oh boy. So, anyway, so he deposed Anthemos, and of course, Justinian, probably turned beet red when he found that out. Now, if you look at, again, when you look at the secondary sources, for example, there's a book called The Invention of Peter, which is complete garbage. It says that Justinian used the Pope to do this. I didn't find this in the primary sources at all. The primary sources say that the Pope figured out that Anthemos was a heretic, he was warned, and that he, like the Liber Pontificalis says, let him confess the two natures then. And he's discovered to be a heretic. Pope Agapetus deposes him, and then he signs a new, slightly revised Formula of Hormisdas, which says the first condition of salvation is to keep the rule of the true faith, and in no way to deviate from the tradition of the fathers, because the teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ cannot be overlooked, which says, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church." These things, which have been said, are proven by the events, for in the Apostolic See the Catholic religion is always preserved inviolate. CSEL 35, 338. Justinian had to sign this clause. Following in all things the Apostolic See, we preach whatever it is laid down, and profess that these things shall be observed inviolably, and shall compel all the bishops to act in accordance with the content of this libellus. The patriarchs to your holiness, metropolitans to the patriarchs, and the rest to their own metropolitans, so that our Catholic Church may have her solidity in all respects. CSEL 35, 340, that's Collectio Adulana. The emperor is also approved, quote, in all respects, embracing all the letters of Leo of blessed memory, which he wrote concerning the Christian faith, as in the original libellus. Now, Saint Agapetus consecrated a virtuous priest named Menas, who's also a saint, who had to sign this: following in all things the Apostolic See, we preach whatever has been laid down by it. I, Menas, by the mercy of God, a priest, receive the four holy synods, and whatever is contained in them, and the teachings and letters of Pope Leo, which he wrote for the faith, CSEL 35, 342. In Novella 43, Justinian condemns Anthemos and his collaborators, noting Anthemos had been deposed first by Agapetus of holy memory and by a council, which we'll be talking about. The edition there is Heimbach, Authenticum, Novellarum Constitutionum Justiniani, Versio Vulgata 1450. Now, the Acta Sanctorum, that's the Bolinist Lives of the Saints that they edited, Acta Sanctorum, volume 45, 179, has a contemporary account which talks about how the Pope expelled Anthemos and his accomplices from the church. When the clergy presented Menas to be ordained, Pope Agapetus required that Menas present a libellus or profession of faith, which he, Agapetus, intended to present to the tomb of Blessed Peter the Apostle. And then the account says he was ordained by, quote, the prince of all the bishops. Now, Pope Agapetus dies. I love this pope. Menas holds a council at Constantinople after this happens. Okay, it starts in Mansi 8, 896. So, there's actually a... In the Acts of the Council, we find, we go like Mansi 8, 900, a few columns going on. There's a libellus from the monks to Agapetus, which comes out now. And they're complaining about all these Miaphysite heretics. And so what they asked him to do, I'm going to quote here directly, quote, they asked him to, quote, do what Saint Celestin did against Nestorius, assigning to him a limit, that is, to Anthemos, just as he did with Nestorius, within which, unless he offers a libellus, meaning an orthodox profession to your apostolic see and to your beatitude, and to the most holy archbishop of the royal city, frees himself from the disease of heresy, you most holy ones may decree him to be stripped of all pontifical dignity and submit him to the condemnation of the heretics. There is also a request from other Orthodox Eastern bishops to Agapetus. We're in the Council of Mansi 914 to 18. Basically saying Christ entrusted to your venerable head the throne of the head of the apostles, and they ask Agapetus to sentence Anthemos. Okay, so here, it's actually the monks themselves who are ready to jump all over the bishop, that is Anthemos, and they're asking him to do what Pope Celestine did with Nestorius, saying, please, give him 10 days, and then, drop the hammer. Okay? The council was held later. Okay? Now, I'm very glad for this segment because this council is almost unheard of. And it's very rarely mentioned, even in the secondary literature. In fact, I found it somewhere, and I can't even remember where I found it or where I could go and find it again in secondary. It is in Mansi, of course. So that's an example of what we do here. You're in the audience. We have priests, I presume. Right? We're trying to give you serious material that you're not going to find elsewhere. All right? So, I think this is a little more worth your time than some of the nonsense we see on social media, but I'll leave that to a good audience. All right, so Craig, it's back.
Thank you, John, and thank you for all the details. So I will now give the Orthodox perspective on the Synod of Constantinople 536. Oh, no, man, now I'm coughing. Anthemus of Constantinople had Miaphysite leanings, the word that John loves, and was pressured by Justinian to resign in March 536. Now, St. Menas was ordained on March 13th, 536, by Pope Agapetus. This happened during the First Council of Constantinople in 536, a small synod with only local clergy. Now, Menas' letter to Jerusalem boasted of his ordination by a pope, as this surely was more impressive than whatever minor bishops also took part in the ordination. However, it's not credible to presume that Menas would have had an obviously non-canonical ordination with only one bishop presiding, even if it's the Pope. Now, additionally, we know from, I can't pronounce the Greek name, Constantinople's synodal decision-making based on archived material, pages 87 to 88, makes mention that multiple bishops signed onto Menas' consecration letter. So, obviously, several bishops are part of the ordination, not just Pope Agapetus single-handedly. Now, due to Anthemus only resigning, or possibly being deposed by peer decree or unilaterally from the Pope, it's not altogether clear from what I could see, a council was necessary to win the assent of the patriarchs, because again, the consent of the patriarchs is needed to depose a patriarch. Now, there's some problems with this. Due to Alexandria and Antioch having Miaphysite patriarchs, the latter Severus was deposed by the synod, and the former Theodosius of Alexandria already had a disputed election against a Julianus, Gaius, who died shortly thereafter, and he was in exile. So they simply replaced him with Paul of Alexandria. So, in effect, with only the Pope and Jerusalem, Anthemus was able to be deposed. The other patriarchates assented retroactively. Okay? Now, the preceding explains the importance of emphasizing the Pope's role, right? Because they didn't have everyone on board. They were deposing two other patriarchs at the same time. The Jerusalem patriarch was not in Constantinople, and the other two patriarchs were unacceptable heretics. Okay, so in any event, Jerusalem's consent was necessary to finalize matters, and I would just like to add, this gets overused in meme apologetics that, look, the Pope single-handedly deposed someone and single-handedly ordained another patriarch. But that's just not true. It's just meme history. All right, so that being said, I'm going to start the Byzantine Papacy, and then, which will also be short, and then I'll give the microphone to John. The Byzantine Papacy, Pope Silverius, Hormisdas' son, was made Pope with Ostrogothic support in their dying days. Probably with the hope that he would not be a Byzantine puppet, right? Which you probably want if you're going to be invaded by the Byzantines. Now, Byzantium retakes Rome and suspecting Severius of sedition, which, by the way, I think most people don't think is actually correct, deposes him. Now, Vigilius, the Roman legate who had earlier went from Constantinople to Rome in hope of being pope after that deposition, was tapped to replace Silverius with the support of Rome's clergy, so he's made pope. Now, this is obviously arbitrary and capricious, so Justinian's appealed to, and he overrules Silverius' enemies, and he sends Silverius to Rome to face trial. And you can read about this in Duffy, Saints and Sinners, I believe on page 66. Now, Vigilius had Silverius arrested again, and the latter died in exile, so he just pretty much didn't listen to Justinian, had Silverius arrested, and from probably bad treatment, he dies. Now, the proceeding is a good example of the harshness and subjugation that the Byzantine Papacy often manifested. All right. And so, with just deserts, Pope Vigilius would later be deposed as a heretic, though he was reinstated when he recanted. Pope Martin would be arrested and replaced against his wishes while he was still alive. He's a saint. Byzantine policy was to force the Pope to act as a tax collector for the local Byzantine garrison and to toe a line sympathetic to Eastern ecclesiastical demands. Rome, being far away from Constantinople, was often able to buck the trend, and politics would decide whether Rome got away with it or meekly went along with the program. All right? So this should all be kept in mind in understanding papal controversies for the next 2 centuries. So that's all I want to say right now on the Byzantine Papacy, because pretty much the next 2 centuries are going to be the Byzantine Papacy. So, John, let me give the microphone over to you for you to present the same topic.
Thanks. I'll try to be brief here. So I had to look this term up, Byzantine Papacy, but apparently what it means is it's referring to when the Byzantines basically reconquered the Italian peninsula using Africa as a springboard. This is beginning. This is under Belisarius, the famous general, 537, around 537 or so, and it continues until, I don't know, like 751, which is apparently when the Exarchate of Ravenna, fell to the Lombards. So that's the basic notion of the term. During this time, we find some of the popes are very involved in Constantinople's affairs. For example, St. Gregory the Great is a representative at Constantinople, the Opera Preciarius. Now, as you mentioned with Pope Vigilius, this is important actually because certain sources say he conspired against Pope Silverius, who is considered a martyr in the Roman Church, by the way. I've attended Mass in Latin for Pope Silverius. For this reason, Pope Vigilius was very much compromised, and if the sources are correct, which I kind of think they are, and we should keep that in mind in this other controversy we're going to talk about at the Fifth Council. Because, to me, it's like, forget theology. It reminds me of the famous Dostoevsky novel, Crime and Punishment. So, a couple other observations. Some of the popes were of Greek or otherwise of Eastern background. This could be important. For example, Pope Theodore is said to have been from Palestine and even the son of a bishop. This is relevant when we're going to talk about it in a couple of weeks, about the papal the papal appointment of a vicar during the Monothelite crisis, with powers to institute entire new hierarchies in the patriarchates. We'll talk about that. Also, I want to talk about St. Sergius, who this is the liturgy, but he's said to have introduced the Agnus Dei into the Roman Mass, that famous prayer, Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi miserere nobis. So we have Eastern Church contributing in certain ways to the Roman liturgy. We sing the Trisagion in Latin and Greek 3 times, and Great and Holy Friday. And finally, Pope Agapetus. Now, he is Greco-Sicilian like I am, my name coming from the cholera, or pastry that you read about sometimes. Greek pastry.
That beats me being named after a roof of a house.
Oh, okay. Yes, but I digress. Now we're going to be talking about this next month, because we'll be talking about the Tome of Agatho, that passage where, referring to the Roman Church as antecedent, he says, or referring to St. Peter and the Roman Church as the antecedent, he says, by whose protection this apostolic church of his, that's the Roman Church, has never turned aside to any part of error, whose authority as that of the Prince of all the Apostles, the entire Catholic Church of Christ, and the Ecumenical Councils, ever faithfully embracing, followed in all things, etc. And the popes also treat the, basically the emperor as a father, treats his son, and the Roman Church and also the Universal Church as the mother of the empire. So we agree probably that we don't have this Freemasonic separation of church and state or any of that. Byzantine Church talks about the idea of symphonia, cooperation between church and state. We Catholics use this. We have a similar word. We say, the scholastics are very precise. They say that they talk about the state being, quote, indirectly subject to the church. So with that, we'll go ahead and turn it back to you, Craig. Do go wherever you want to go with this.
Well, John, it's your turn. You could talk about Pope Vigilius and the Fifth Ecumenical Council.
Okay. Well, I got just enough gas in the tank for that. Now, again, I have to skip the background. I apologize for that. We have to go right to that point where Pope Vigilius compromised, probably, as I said, according to the sources, because of what he did to Pope Symerius. Even the Liber Pontificalis talks about this. So he's brought to Constantinople to condemn the 3 chapters. I hope you all know what that is. The emperor perhaps thought this was going to, create a great reconciliation with the Miaphysites. Perhaps untold millions would come back into the Orthodox Church. So this had to be done. So Pope Vigilius is brought to Rome. There's a council. He's already condemned the 3 chapters, but it begins to cause the beginning of a schism. Actually, he's synodically excommunicated by the African bishops. That's one of the chroniclers. So you can see that he's under duress for that reason. If he continues in the council doing this and doing it publicly, there may be a schism. So he's under duress. He tries to escape, and he's not even allowed sanctuary in a church. He's brought back by force. The Liber Pontificalis even says that he was led around by a rope around his neck. Funem in colo eius. Now, we don't have to quibble about whether the Liber is accurate or a great source. That's not the main point here. But he was held by force and under duress with this condemnation of the chapters the way Justinian wanted it, potentially leading to a schism. We must keep this in mind. So the council opens, and I want to get to session 7, where there's a decree of Justinian declaring, now we'll use I studied it in Nancy, but we'll use the Father Price translation. Talks about Justinian being alien to the Christian name, and he's to be, technically, they call it a decree, which the council, quote, receives. That Justinian's going to be excluded from the diptychs. So the council, quote, receives this decree and does what he says. Okay? And I apologize because I'm just running out of steam here. But we have to do this. We have to do this. So, what happens? Well, first I'll tell you what actually happened, and then some of the tall tales and extravagant stories that I've heard from the other side, shall we say. So what happens is, of course, that after 6 months, Pope Vigilius finally breaks. He goes ahead and signs the condemnation of the chapters. He had scruples about the anathematization of a dead man, Theodore of Mopsuestia. He may have found from Canon 6 of Damascus that Rome had already condemned the teaching of Theodore, so maybe that was what made him get over his scruple. We don't know. Father Price talks about all this in his commentary and notes. December 8th, he writes a letter. Now, I have written that he approved of the council, but technically, what he did was approve the condemnation of the chapters that the council had done and acknowledged the bishops as his brothers. And then he wrote the second Constitutum, also in detail giving the condemnation of the chapters. I'm not sure if there is a passage in there expressly approving the council as such. It's a bit, Father Price notes this as well. So, again, what happens after this point? So, he never does make it back to Rome. He dies on the way back. And the deacon Pelagius, who was in his entourage and originally opposed the council, switches sides. He changes sides, and there is a schism. First of all, there's a schism. He's not trusted. He's being excluded from the diptychs, and the Liber Pontificalis says he actually goes to St. Peter's and holds the cross and the Gospels over his head and solemnly swears or affirms that he had nothing to do with the death of Pope Vigilius. Okay? So, let's take all of that and sort of freeze frame right there with this condemnation of Pope Vigilius. Okay? How does the council become ecumenical? Well, in his letters, Pope Pelagius makes it clear that it is schism to refuse to accept the council. It is binding. It is as binding as any other council. But he only talks about the dogmatic decrees here. Basically, the condemnation of the chapters is what he really talks about in his letters, which I've read in the Latin. That's what he really talks about. And Father Price talks about how this condemnation of Vigilius was quietly removed from the Acts in a new Latin edition. I don't believe the Greek has survived. So this is the way the council was acknowledged as ecumenical in the West, with Pope Pelagius defending it, or defending the dogmatic decrees expressly, and saying that this schism is not okay, it needs to stop. Okay, and it didn't, this lasted particularly in northern Italy, for like almost 150 years. Now, the stories that I've heard, what have we been told by the other side? What have I heard on this? Let's get this. Remember that Vigilius is held by force under duress, because if he signs this, it might mean a schism in the West. We were told that it's the consent of the patriarchs that's needed to remove a patriarch. Well, I've been told that the council, quote, excommunicated Vigilius. I've heard that it, quote, suspended him from his office. I've heard that Pope Vigilius was on a collision course with the ecclesiology of consensus. I've heard all of that. How does this work? The rule of the councils is supposed to be that a council is ecumenical in force, ratified, when the Pope ratifies it, certainly if it's a Council of the East. So, for all those who have been making these kinds of claims, my question is, how is it more than a Council of Eastern Bishops before Rome assents to this council? And how would such a council get the authority, the apostolic authority, to, quote, excommunicate him, quotes, or excommunicate him without quotes, with or without quotes, suspend, or anything else? That's for them to explain. They told us last month that Nestorius was still a bishop when he went into Ephesus, if he had gone into Ephesus at the time that the council. Nestorius was still a bishop. He still had all his honorifics. They told us. They told us that. So a heresiarch gets full due process. A council of East and West, ratified by Rome through legates. All right, 3 canonical warnings, which he spurns, and then he's deposed. So they tell us. What happens when it's a pope? Well, I don't know. Council of purely Eastern bishops, maybe 6 or so from Africa, a few from other places, suspends, excommunicates, quote, excommunicates, with or without the quotes, He's on a collision course with the ecclesiology of consent. I don't know how many times I heard that phrase last month. Ecclesiology of consent. Right? Why did they give us all these explanations that trip all over each other, like junior high school students dropping acid?
Sorry, that's great.
I think it's because maybe they're trying to make a point about the council being superior to the Pope. Now, we had this problem. We had this issue in the West, by the way, much later. It didn't happen until much later. 1400s, remember the Council of Basel? Remember the popes are willing to approve certain things, disapprove certain things, kind of qualified approval. We approve of this, but not that. We'll send a legate, blah, blah, blah. Eventually, they just got tired. The council just got completely out of control and threatened to, depose the Pope and demand, get summoned and demand he appear and all of this stuff. And the Pope, Eugenius, I think the Pope Eugenius just decided, they're so full of themselves, I'm just not going to put up with this. They can do whatever they want to do. And he just said, okay, fine. We'll move it to Ferrara. Do your worst. Okay? So these are questions that I wanted to leave here. Okay? And it's important for the audience. These are for those who are discerning. Okay? We have to, for those in the audience that aren't sure what they think, all right, their minds are not made up. It's for you to discern these things. So hold your mind on these things and freeze frame, not the song, but on these different interpretations of the council. Okay, so Craig, back to you.
John, that was awesome. I like this new salty version of John. And I do think it shows there's a line in the sand historically, epistemically, in this particular episode is where people really have to pay attention. So the nadir of the papacy as it has occurred at this council, because it excommunicated Pope Vigilius, and the same Pope repented, blamed his doctrinal errors on Satan, and accepted a council whose decree endorsed the consensus-based ecclesiastical model of the church. So pretty much everything that John and I disagree about is summed up by this one council. Now, Vigilius certainly advanced high papal rhetoric, where interestingly didn't come up in John's presentation. So I will quote Vigilius being at his most papal. In an excommunication letter, Pope Vigilius identifies himself as, quote him, the Prelates in Constantinople II, Volume 1, page 163. Containing, he speaks of himself, the role and authority of the blessed Peter the Apostle, page 164. He decreed that those who disagreed with him, to quote him in the same letter, are stripped both of priestly dignity and Catholic communion, and that they may recover your rank through the mercifulness of either myself or after my death, my successor. I mean, come on, let's be honest. Taken at face value, this seems to say that Rome has the highest rank and can unilaterally decide who is Catholic and who is not. But the proceeding is not accurate. Why? Because Vigilius expounded the consensus-based ecclesiology of the church. Now, his resistance to Justinian's edict preceding Constantinople II in the same letter was voiced as follows. He said that things are being transacted, to quote him, without resolution by the council. In Dum in Sancte Euphemiae, which I'm sure John pronounces much better than I do, it's written, as it identifies itself, by Vigilius, Bishop of the Holy Catholic Church of the City of Rome to the whole people of God. Same book, page 170. Something later Roman Catholic theology calls an ex cathedra pronouncement. He identifies that Justinian and everyone else is, quoting him, obliged to wait for a common resolution, this ex cathedra letter, and they were suspended as transgressors and were excluded from communion with the see of the blessed Apostle Peter, which, page 171, which he identifies, page 172, as our communion in this ex cathedra letter. Now, this means he viewed excommunications as local, not binding, our communion, specifically the see of the blessed Apostle Peter. Right? So we let him explain himself. He's taken a view consistent with the consensus-based model of the church. Now you go, oh, well, you're taking too much from his words. Well, we got a contemporary source that tells us how they interpret the same words. It's the letter of the Church of Milan to the Frankish envoys, written contemporarily with the preceding documents, and it literally delineates which local communion those who opposed Vigilius were excluded from. I'm going to quote the letter, right? Page 168, same book. The most blessed Pope Vigilius admonished all the bishops in the following words: whoever agrees to give the edict of Justinian his assent is to know that he is suspended from the communion of the Apostolic See. The holy Dacian of Milan also gave his testimony before all when he exclaimed loudly, mark that both myself and all the priests of the region which my church belongs, that is Gaul, Burgundy, Spain, Liguria, Aemilia, and Venetia, that's from Spain to Italy, guys, attest that whoever assents to the edict of Justinian will be excluded from communion with the bishops of the above mentioned provinces. So it doesn't get any clearer that these are local excommunications. Not my opinion. This is what the sources explicitly state. Now, Vigilius' opposition was based upon the authority of his see and, to quote him, page 171, the ecclesiastical canons, not citing that his prerogatives are sourced irrespective to the canons. Now, that sounds like a boring point, but it makes much more sense as the centuries go on, because Rome will later not make that claim. Now, Vigilius' first constitutum, likewise, which was a counter-council against the Ecumenical Council, specified, the quote it, volume 2, page 146, same book, that whatever was affirmed orthodox in those places by common consent with the legates, we revere and accept as orthodox without revision or alteration. So what is the Roman criteria according to another ex-cathedra statement about what an ecumenical council is? Common consent, as long as the Roman legates are also involved. Not my words, Pope Vigilius' words, an ex-cathedra statement. It should also be noted that the same document defended the heretical 3 chapters as not heretical, a clear example of a pope teaching heresy. All right, and you go, well, Craig, you just quoted it teaching common consent and it teaching something heretical. That how could he use it as a proof text? Because I don't believe in papal infallibility. I'm just saying, if you do, you have to now accept what this document states. Now, in sum, even at its most papal, Vigilius' excommunications were entirely local in nature, just like Victor's centuries beforehand. And the ecclesiology he was expounding was explicitly consensus-based. Additionally, he defended the heretical 3 chapters. These are all relevant when we talk about the history of the papacy. Now, backtracking his own demands, Vigilius refused to attend the Ecumenical Council, right? Remember he said he wanted a council, then he refused to go. Vigilius was that sort of character. Now, what did the council, how did they respond? The council responded by 1, excommunicating him, and 2, teaching consensus-based ecclesiology so as to delineate that the Pope must take correction from the council. All right, I'm going to quote the council, session 7. All right, this is in Price, Acts of the Council, volume 2, pages 99 and 101, because it's pretty long, so this is how I condense it. The Holy Council said, may the sacred decree be duly received and read. They read the decree of Justinian. They say, we have pronounced that his name, Vigilius, is alien to Christians, is not read out in the sacred diptychs. The Holy Council said, what has now seemed good, let us therefore preserve unity with the Apostolic See of the Sacrosanct Church of the Elder Rome, transacting everything according to the tenor of the text, i.e. the decree that just deposed Vigilius, that have been read. Now, to quote Collorafi and Butler, so it's not just my opinion that removing from the diptychs is an excommunication. This is in Keys, 2004, page 130. When the church named a person in the diptychs, she professed her communion with that individual. So what does it mean when they don't pronounce her name in the diptychs? That they're not in communion with that individual. What's that called? Excommunication. Hence, Pope Vigilius himself was literally excommunicated, but not the Roman Synod itself, whose consent with the other synods to the council was necessary for it to establish consensus. The idea was if Vigilius would not recant, he, like this deposed predecessor, Pope Silverius, he would simply be replaced with someone more manipulable, right? Because they did it in the past, why wouldn't you just go do it again? Now, 2, The same session purposely read a slew of documents showing that Vigilius had previously affirmed the denunciation of the 3 chapters, intending to demonstrate that Rome had already consented in advance to the work of the council. Why else do this? Nicaea too, by the way, did the same thing in session 3 concerning a previous synodical decree of the Oriental patriarchs, because of the controversy of whether or not those 2 legates that did come were representing a local standing synods. All right, so this is not the last time an ecumenical council would do the same thing. Now, the preceding consensus-based approach to ecclesiology was explicitly dogmatized in the council sentence. So John in his presentation saying, well, Rome accepted this abrogated version of the minutes of the council, which means Rome didn't accept the deposition of Vigilius. Not only did we have future Western documents that called Vigilius a heretic, so that's not the issue. The reality is that the longer version of the minutes, the one that include the deposition, it's the only manuscript, and it's in Latin. It's the only extant manuscript of this council. The other manuscript that's shortened was lost. It's lost. And so we just have to trust that all that stuff really is left out. They found fragments of the lost manuscript, but honestly, until we have the critical editions in front of us, I can't vouch for the fact that it actually totally aligns in the excommunication section. Now, that being said, what do we know for sure? That both traditions, if we accept them, of these minutes include the conciliar decree. And what's the conciliar decree say? It says this: Vigilius was staying, now remember, no title for Vigilius, just says Vigilius. Vigilius was staying in this imperial city and ought to have taken part. Our most pious emperor urged both Vigilius and ourselves to meet together, since it is appropriate for priests to oppose a common solution. We recall to his memory the great example of the apostles and the traditions of the fathers. For even though individual apostles abounded with the grace of the Holy Spirit, so that they did not need the advice of others, they met together and each of them confirmed his statements from the testimonies of the divine scriptures. Just so you know, guys, this is an ecumenical council saying that you need the divine scriptures to teach doctrine. It's not that doctrine and scriptures are totally divorced from one another. The decree continues. The Holy Fathers also, who convened at various times in the Holy Four Councils, followed the ancient precedent. Again, it shows that the ecumenical councils merely followed the apostles in teaching what the scriptures teach. Now it continues. Since it is certain that it is through joint examination, when there is expounded what needs to be discussed on both sides, that the light of truth dispels the darkness of lies. For neither is it permissible in the case of faith for anyone to anticipate the judgment of the church in her totality. Right? So no person without joint examination could make a judgment for the church. This is in the decree of the Fifth Ecumenical Council. All right? And that same decree did not identify Vigilius as bishop, which to everyone, because every bishop in ecumenical council has a title, shows his deposition. So in both conciliar documents, Vigilius' deposition is part of what was accepted by the Roman Church. Take that to the bank. This is not by mistake. Now also, the joint examination or consensus is non-negotiable, right? This decree says this is the only way it happens. And so the idea that any individual can make a singular judgment for the church, like Vigilius did in the First Constitutum, which is why they were writing this, is disallowed. So they were literally actually contradicting Vigilius in anticipation that his statement in the First Constitutum would be the binding statement. They say, no, that's disallowed. That's what the decree teaches, and that's what all the churches, including Rome, accepted when they accepted this council. Now, Vigilius and the Roman synods acceptance of the conciliar decree means this must be dogma in their church if they're consistent. Now, Vigilius capitulated and blamed. So it gets better than this. You think like all this is just, wow, this is really the Orthodox side really fighting back. It actually gets crazier. Vigilius capitulated. He repents. He's going to accept this council. But why? He blames, to quote Vigilius, in the letter to Eutychius, pages 215 and page 218 of the volume 2, the enemy of the human race, that's Satan, for deceiving him, right, into writing against the 3 chapters. So he says, yeah, Satan deceived me. That's why I wrote something heretical. And then he annulled the First Constitutum by the authority of our present letter. Right? So now he annuls his previous ex cathedra statement. Now, for over a century, the council lacked reception in parts of the West, because obviously this is such a mess, right? So despite papal ratification, right, if the West, if you say, oh, it's an Eastern Council and they didn't have this high papal view, well, why did the whole Western Church lack this high papal view? The Pope accepted the council, they didn't. In fact, the Council of Toledo in 653 and 684, that much later, over 100 years later, and they were in communion with Rome, failed to recognize this council. All right? And so that is my passionate presentation of the Fifth Ecumenical Council and the events surrounding it. I will give a summary of this century, and then I will give John the last word, and he could give a summary. The 6th century in this episode, guys, began with the Symacchean Forgeries and the Formula of Hormisdas. In my humble view, neither had a profound ecclesiastical ramifications during their time, but they did present rhetorical advances, and that in little more than a century's time, next century is going to be really interesting. John and I can agree much more than people think, help form a basis of an evolution in papal claims. These rhetorical advances were intended to shield Rome from foreign domination. Well, will prove to be a consistent theme in the evolution of the papacy. They have to continually avoid themselves from being subjugated by Byzantium, by the Lombards, by the Franks, by the Normans. Let's keep going down the list. Holy Roman Empire. Now, Pope Severius, anyway, as for the 6th century, though, right? So we see Rome will grow in the future, but in the 6th century, it's much less triumphant for the papacy. This is really their nadir in the ancient church. The Fifth Ecumenical Council excommunicated the Pope Vigilius, who himself was a guy who replaced a deposed pope, Pope Silverius, who was not a Byzantine puppet. Now, the council, the Fifth Ecumenical Council, dogmatized, all right, that no single bishop can infallibly define doctrine for the church, which ironically anticipates papal doctrine many centuries later, contradicting it. Now, no one believed in unilateral papal ratification of councils, even in the West, where Vigilius himself expounded a consensus-based ecclesiology. So the Pope and others explicitly delineated that the Pope speaks only for his own synod, and his excommunications are merely locally binding. Not my words, those are his words, our synod. Now, one must reflect that any awareness of medieval and modern papal doctrines is conspicuously absent in this century. So this is my challenge to John and to you, the audience, is we went with what we actually saw in the events of this century. We went with what the documents actually said. Where are explicitly these later papal doctrines? Are just not there. It doesn't mean you can't infer them. I'm just making the point. They're not explicitly there. But I could find a plethora of examples of consensus-based ecclesiology that are explicit, that are quoted by the Pope, that are quoted by ecumenical councils, quoted all over the place. So that, I think, gives us a lot to chew on. So with that, I will end my summary. And John, let me give you an opportunity for an impassioned summary.
Thank you. Okay, so it's for those who are discerning, your minds aren't quite made up. We tried our best to, of course, to clarify and explain some of the different and discordant assertions you hear about. First, the pseudo-Symaccheans, then the Formula of Hormisdas, Pope Agapetus, the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and so on. It's obvious from Craig's presentation that we don't have a complete agreement. We're still far from that. But I hope we help to clarify things for the audience, to make some progress in understanding. Please, if you are still discerning, I encourage you to pray to the Holy Fathers, the Council, and also to such popes as Hormisdas and St. Agapetus, and they will help you to find the truth. Christmas is coming for us all in a month. I hope everybody has a wonderful Christmas, wonderful presents. My Christmas will come, my presents will come, when there's once again a holy pope such as Agapetus, who will defrock with his bare hands all of the unworthy priests he finds along his way. If you have the faith of the fathers, then you necessarily have the faith of Saint Hormisdas and Saint Agapitus. And if you have that faith, I can have hope someday to be in one communion with you, in which is the true and entire solidity of the Christian religion. So, until that blessed day, I can have my prayers and my aspirations and my dreams. It's not there yet, but that will be when my presents come for Christmas. All right, Craig, thank you very much. Good night, everyone.
Well, guys, I think Christmas coming up, we should consider John's book, Keys Over the Christian World. It's so much of the content we're talking about today is from that book, and I know John doesn't want me plugging it, but I just can help to say that, John, being that we're talking about Christmas presents. And as for Union, we just had Nicaea 2025 last week. There's some rumblings. I just heard some rumblings that there is talk of a false union in Greece. So that's certainly interesting. That we'll be seeing definitely some news in the upcoming years. But of course, I think John and I, we want a union in truth and not an ecumenist one. And this will give people a lot to look forward to. That sort of comes up in the next century. So we'll have a lot of fun talking about that. So, John, let me give an opportunity for plugs before you run, if you haven't ran already. Yes,
thank you. Well, first of all, yes, about Nicaea, yes. It's isn't it ironic that both of us, the hardliners on both sides are warning first about a false union in the manner of the ecumenists, of course. We had a stream last week, which got to be very jokey and lighthearted. And if the transcript falls into the wrong hands, I fear that the Diamond Brothers could perhaps put us all behind bars for whatever we said last week.
Uh-oh, they're deputized?
But anyway, we think possibly being a little facetious there, a little hypothetical. But as far as promos, again, I say my promo is for those of you who are seeking. My promo is for the Holy Fathers of the Councils and for St. Agapitus and for St. Hormisdas. Continue to pray for them, and they will help you. If you are determined that wild horses cannot keep you from reaching the truth, then by the grace of God you can and you will get there. And I hope and pray that you make it. And we're doing this precisely to remove the roadblocks between you and the truth and you and the historical sources that you see set up before you because perhaps bad pastors failed you or the educational system failed you. So I was willing to give my time to try to help in whatever way I could for that and make up for it. So, all right, thank you so much again. Everybody, thank you, Craig. Until next time.
And thank you, John. My plugs for orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate. We need donors, consistent donors, $1, $5, $10, $100. Donate once a month. We are starting missionary initiatives. God willing, we'll have a mission, an additional missionary there in a couple months. And we're going to be working on trying to make more converts and build up these parishes. So we need support. We need to be able to house, feed, and take care of these people, especially if someone's discerning to do it vocationally. We really need to step up. So please do that. Please pray for John and I. And of course, if this has blessed you, just bless. It could be orthodoxchristiantheology.com/donate, which this thing's below. But bless a faithful monastery. Someone didn't close down during COVID. If this has blessed you, bless someone else, and God will bless you. And I will end this show as I quote all my shows by quoting Jesus the Rock. Fight to death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. God bless you. Have a great day.